Not a story about giants, a story about how a warrior tradition can disappear from history without one final battle. For centuries, that name appeared on European maps. Sometimes it covered Siberia, sometimes Central Asia, sometimes Mongolia, Manchuria, and lands reaching toward the Pacific. It looked enormous. It looked mysterious. And to the modern eye, it can look almost impossible, a name so large, yet so absent from ordinary history books. But this is not a video claiming that Tartaria was a hidden world empire. It is not a claim that giant soldiers once marched across Asia and were erased by a secret order. The real question is narrower, and perhaps more unsettling. If Tartaria was a broad European label for many peoples and territories of the Eurasian steppe, then where are the armies of that world in popular memory? Where are the deeper histories of the warrior traditions that lived under, around, and before that name? A map can show rivers, mountains, roads, and borders. But some forms of power are harder to draw: speed, endurance, horse mastery, alliance, and the ability to vanish over the horizon before an empire has finished counting its soldiers. Before going further, we have to be careful. Tartaria was not a country in the modern sense. It was not one unified empire with one capital, one flag, and one official army. In early modern European geography, Tartaria was a broad label used for many different regions and peoples across northern and central Asia. It gathered communities that did not necessarily see themselves as one people. That matters. We cannot simply ask, where is the army of Tartaria, as if Tartaria were France, Russia, or China. There was no single Tartarian general staff waiting to be found in a lost archive. But the question does not disappear. The lands grouped under names like Tartaria were connected to some of the most powerful military traditions in world history: Scythians, Huns, Xiongnu, Turkic confederations, Mongols, Tatars, and many other steppe communities whose names changed depending on who was writing. The real mystery is not whether a secret Tartarian empire was hidden from history. The real mystery is why the military history of the steppe is so often told in fragments. A terrifying invasion here, a border raid there, a strange tribe in one chronicle, a nomadic custom in another. The pieces are everywhere, but the system behind them often fades into the margins. To follow that silence, we begin not with a king, but with a prisoner. In 1709, at the Battle of Poltava, the Swedish army suffered a crushing defeat against the forces of Peter the Great. Among the captured was a Swedish officer named Philip Johann von Strahlenberg. Like many prisoners of that war, he was sent east into Russian territory. Eventually, he spent years in Siberia. For most people, captivity would have meant only survival. But Strahlenberg became an observer. He studied geography, rivers, languages, trade routes, customs, and peoples. Later, his writings helped shape how Europeans imagined Siberia and Inner Asia. And yet, with observers like Strahlenberg, a strange imbalance appears. Here was a man with rare access to frontier spaces, a man interested in peoples and landscapes, a man who recorded much about geography and ethnography. But the military traditions of the communities around him do not emerge with the same depth one might expect. That does not mean he hid anything. He was not writing a military manual. He may not have had access to local war knowledge. As a prisoner under Russian control, he lived within political limits. He wrote at a time when Russia was expanding its reach and transforming Siberia into imperial space. Still, the imbalance is worth noticing. Again and again, European sources describe lands, customs, trade, and peoples. But when it comes to the internal military logic of the steppe, the record becomes thinner, scattered, and filtered through outsiders. To understand why, we have to stop imagining the steppe as empty. The Eurasian steppe was not a blank space between civilizations. It was a vast human corridor connecting East Asia, Central Asia, Siberia, the Black Sea, and Eastern Europe. Migrations passed through it. Trade routes crossed it. Armies moved across it. Languages, weapons, religions, and political ideas traveled along its grasslands. In settled empires, power was often written in stone: cities, walls, palaces, granaries, tax records, and decrees. But on the steppe, power looked different. It could be measured in horses, kinship ties, marriage alliances, grazing rights, seasonal movement, and the authority of war leaders. To an empire of walls, this looked unstable. To a bureaucrat, it looked disorganized. To a chronicler, it could look primitive. But on the battlefield, that so-called disorder could become a devastating advantage. Steppe warfare did not need castles to be sophisticated. Its sophistication was mobile. Children learned to ride early. Hunters learned distance and timing. Warriors used composite bows suited for mounted combat. Armies could travel with remounts, move faster than infantry forces, and survive away from fixed supply lines. False retreats, encirclement, rapid strikes, and psychological pressure became part of a military language many settled armies struggled to answer. This is the first key to the mystery. If historians look for power only where settled states leave paperwork, then steppe power can appear less organized than it really was. Not because it lacked structure, but because its structure did not always leave the same kind of archive. Long before Europeans wrote Tartaria across Asia, the steppe had already produced warrior societies that haunted the imagination of settled worlds. The Scythians are one of the oldest examples. Known from ancient sources and archaeology, they were associated with mounted warfare, archery, rich burial mounds, weapons, horse remains, and a culture in which mobility and combat were deeply connected. Ancient writers described them with fascination and fear. Archaeology shows not a fantasy race, but a complex steppe world. Riders, weapons, elites, animals, trade, and ritual. Some old descriptions speak of impressive bodies and fierce warriors. Those descriptions must be handled carefully. They do not prove giant soldiers. They tell us something more grounded. In some steppe societies, environment, diet, riding, hunting, warfare, and social selection could produce fighters who seemed physically and culturally alien to settled observers. Then came the Huns, whose arrival near the borders of the Roman world in the late 4th century created shockwaves. Roman writers often describe them in harsh and exaggerated terms. We should not read those descriptions as neutral anthropology. Roman authors turned enemies into monsters because monsters made better warnings. But beneath the prejudice was a real military problem. The Huns represented a style of war Rome found difficult to contain, fast, mobile, politically flexible, and terrifyingly effective when united under strong leadership. Once again, the settled world struggled not only to defeat a steppe force, but to describe it accurately. Farther east, Chinese sources recorded encounters with northern nomadic powers such as the Xiongnu. These records show diplomacy, tribute, war, marriage alliances, frontier strategy, and the constant tension between sedentary states and mobile confederations. But they too must be read with care. Court historians wrote from within imperial systems, with political assumptions about order, civilization, border, and threat. This raises an important question. When settled empires wrote about steppe peoples, were they describing military reality, or were they also turning that reality into a political category? Were these groups recorded as rival powers, dangerous outsiders, barbarians, border problems, or administrative subjects? Often, the answer is all of these at once. Then, in the 13th century, the steppe became impossible to dismiss. The Mongols showed what could happen when steppe military systems were unified, disciplined, and directed at continental scale. Their armies built the largest contiguous land empire in history. They shattered kingdoms, crossed deserts, adapted to sieges, absorbed engineers, used intelligence networks, coordinated units across great distances, and turned mobility into strategy. Nothing supernatural is needed to explain Mongol power. Their strength came from real systems: cavalry, discipline, command structure, communication, scouting, psychological warfare, adaptation, and logistics rooted in nomadic life. But even when we explain the tactics, one question remains: what kind of society produces generations of people able to fight like that? A Mongol warrior was not created in a barracks over a few months. He emerged from an entire way of life. Riding was not a hobby. Movement was not a campaign condition. It was normal existence. Survival in harsh climates, care for animals, hunting, endurance, and obedience to group discipline all helped make mounted warfare possible. The secret of the steppe was not magic. It was a system of life in which war, mobility, and survival were almost impossible to separate. This is where the modern myth of giant soldiers of Tartaria enters the story. Online, Tartaria is often surrounded by claims of lost technology, hidden empires, impossible architecture, and giant human beings erased from history. Most of these claims are not supported by reliable evidence. Reports of giants have appeared in many cultures and travel accounts. European travelers often exaggerated peoples they considered distant or strange. The famous stories about giants in Patagonia are a useful warning. For a time, many people took such reports seriously. Later, they were largely reinterpreted as exaggeration, misunderstanding, or myth-making around unusually tall people. So, we should be direct. There is no solid basis for claiming a secret race of 8-foot Tartarian soldiers. That belongs to legend. But legends sometimes grow around a smaller truth. A tired infantryman facing elite mounted fighters from the steppe might not need to see a literal giant to feel he was facing something beyond ordinary experience. A warrior who was taller, stronger, better fed, better trained, more confident on horseback, and hardened by a brutal environment could become, in memory, something larger than life. The giant may be wrong in form but meaningful as a symbol. It may point toward a real historical discomfort. Settled societies often did not know how to describe steppe military excellence except as savagery, strangeness, or terror. And later, once those regions were absorbed into empires, the same traditions could be reduced even further. This brings us back to maps. A map is never just a picture of the world. It is also an argument about the world. It tells the viewer what matters, who owns what, where borders begin, and which names deserve to survive. When a place is named, it enters a political imagination. When a name disappears, memory changes with it. Tartaria faded from maps as imperial systems expanded and reorganized the regions it once covered. Russian power pushed across Siberia and into Central Asia. The Qing state shaped Inner Asia from the east. Britain became intensely interested in Central Asia during the Great Game. Administrative labels replaced older geographic generalities: Siberia, Russian Turkestan, Mongolia, Manchuria, Chinese Central Asia, and many others. This was not necessarily a secret deletion. It was something more ordinary and more powerful: classification. Empires need to make frontier lands governable. They measure them, name them, count populations, sort languages, identify tribes, map rivers, record resources, watch trade routes, decide which groups can be allied with, taxed, relocated, or controlled. In that process, local military traditions can become inconvenient. A land is easier to rule if it is described as fragmented, tribal, backward, or waiting to be administered by a larger order. It is harder to rule if it is remembered as a place with its own political systems, military elites, memories of victory, and traditions of independence. No secret meeting is required. Each empire only has to write the frontier in the way that benefits its own authority. Russia writes Siberia as imperial space. Britain writes Central Asia through strategy and intelligence. Chinese dynastic records frame northern and western peoples through court-centered ideas of order and border management. Different systems, different languages, different archives. But the final result can look similar. The warrior becomes a nomad. The military system becomes a custom. The political confederation becomes a tribe. The battlefield tradition becomes ethnographic color. That may be one of the quietest ways history changes. Consider horseback riding from childhood. In one book, it might be described as a cultural habit, but in military terms, it is a training system. It creates balance, reflex, endurance, and confidence that cannot easily be manufactured in adult recruits. Consider hunting. It might be called subsistence, but it also trains distance judgment, patience, coordination, and movement across terrain. Consider seasonal migration. It might be called wandering, but it also builds knowledge of routes, water, pasture, weather, and survival over long distances. The same facts can be written in two ways. As customs, they become background. As military infrastructure, they become history. This does not mean every nomadic community was secretly an army. That would be another oversimplification. The point is more precise. When war skills are embedded inside everyday life, outsiders may fail to recognize them as a system. So where should we look for the missing military history of the lands once called Tartaria? Probably not in one hidden book. More likely, the answer is scattered across thousands of fragments. Maps can show how European imagination labeled the region, but maps cannot prove armies. Travel accounts preserve impressions, but they carry exaggeration and fear. Military reports may contain practical observations about local strength, routes, horse supply, weapons, and alliances, but those reports often remain separate from popular history. Court chronicles can preserve political and military information, but must be read with awareness of imperial viewpoint. Archaeology can give us graves, weapons, horse bones, trauma on skeletons, and material culture. Oral traditions can preserve memory, but they need comparison with other evidence. The answer may not be hidden. It may simply be misfiled. Perhaps the missing history is in reports never written as history, in maps made for conquest, in diplomatic notes, in burial sites, in descriptions of customs that are actually training practices, in stories dismissed as legend because no one asked what military reality might stand behind them. Some armies disappear because they are destroyed. A final battle is fought. A capital burns. A king is captured. A treaty is signed. The date enters the record. But other military traditions do not end that way. They dissolve. Alliances break apart. Empires fragment. Warriors enter the service of new states. Names change. Communities are absorbed into administrative categories. Old titles lose meaning. Frontier fighters become imperial cavalry, local police, border subjects, or simply nomads in someone else's book. There is no last battlefield, no final charge, no day when the world can say, here the armies of this tradition ended. Only ink, new maps, new borders, new census categories, new names written over old ones. If we use the word Tartaria carefully, not as a secret empire, but as a historical label for a vast imagined geography, then the lost armies of Tartaria may mean something very different from the myth. They may be the many warrior traditions of the Eurasian steppe that were never fully gathered into one familiar story, not erased all at once, but divided, renamed, classified, and reduced until their military meaning became harder to see. So, what were the giant soldiers of Tartaria, really? Almost certainly not literal giants, almost certainly not proof of a hidden global civilization. The myth fails when treated as evidence, but as a symbol, it points toward a real absence. Popular history often remembers the Mongols because they became impossible to ignore. It remembers the Huns because Rome feared them. It remembers the Scythians in fragments, the Xiongnu through Chinese records, the Tatars through the shock they gave medieval Europe and Russia. Yet the broader military world of the steppe is still often treated as a series of interruptions in other people's histories. They arrive, they terrify, they disappear, but they did not come from nowhere. They came from systems of life that produced speed, endurance, command, discipline, and violence on a scale settled states often misunderstood. Maybe that is the real story behind the name Tartaria. Not that an empire was erased in one grand conspiracy. Not that giants were buried under archives, but that a vast military tradition was repeatedly translated into categories that made it smaller. Tribe, custom, frontier, nomad, problem, subject. History may not have hidden the truth. It may simply have asked the wrong questions. And perhaps, somewhere in old maps, travel journals, military reports, court histories, graves, and oral memories, there remains another way to read the steppe. Not as empty space, not as a blank between civilizations, but as one of the great military landscapes of human history. There may be no giant army waiting under the dust of an archive, but there may be something more human and more difficult to recover. The scattered memory of warrior traditions that once made empires afraid, then were renamed, divided, and made smaller on the page. Not everything lost is destroyed. Some things are only misplaced for so long that we forget how to look for them.